You know, when you're maybe filling up the car or just grabbing your usual coffee and you just suddenly think, wow, this costs more than it did.
Oh, yeah. We're all
Why?
feeling that pinch, aren't we?
Definitely. So today we're not just, skimming the surface of inflation. We've got this really interesting piece from Mark over at Knowledge is King.
Ah, yes. Kick. Good stuff, usually.
Right. And it digs into a question I find genuinely fascinating. When prices are climbing, who's really pulling the strings more? Is it us, the consumers, making choices every day?
Yeah.
Or is it the shareholders, the investors behind the scenes influencing those big
And
companies?
crucially, the article hints at something else, doesn't it?
It does. It asks kind of implicitly, why don't we talk about this specific power struggle more often? Why is that conversation sometimes avoided?
Exactly. So forget the dry textbook definitions for a bit. This deep dive is about, well, trying to get a handle on the real forces pushing those costs up.
Looking at our demand versus shareholder decisions.
Yeah, which one holds more weight? It sounds simple, but it's really, really complex. And the source, like you said, suggests there are maybe reasons why this particular tug of war isn't always debated openly.
Okay, so let's tackle the side we probably interact with most directly, us, consumers. The article brings up demand pull inflation. Can you give us a really clear sort of everyday picture of that? How our collective wanting pushes prices up?
Sure. Um, think about, okay, imagine a brand new, super hyped up gaming console launches. Suddenly, everyone wants one. Like right now.
Yeah, queues around the block, websites crashing.
Exactly. The makers just can't churn them out fast enough for that huge spike in demand. So what happens next?
Scalpers, bidding wars, higher prices even from official sellers if they can get away with it.
Precisely. You see bidding, crazy secondhand prices, limited stock driving things up, that intense desire from consumers pulling on a supply that just isn't there yet. That's demand pull right there.
Okay, like the housing boom example the article uses too. Suddenly, it felt like everyone was trying to buy a house.
Mhm.
That demand didn't just make the house prices themselves jump, though, did it? It spread out.
Oh, absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
That surge in housing demand creates ripples. Think of it, suddenly you need way more lumber, more concrete, more electricians, plumbers, real estate agents.
Right.
All those connected industries and materials
Mm-hmm.
can see their prices go up too, just because there's so much more demand hitting them all at once. It's all linked.
Okay. Now, the article also mentions the other side, cost push inflation, and how we consumers are involved there too. That one sounds, I don't know, less like we're actively wanting the price increase.
That's a good way to put it. Yeah, cost push is more about what it costs to make the stuff in the first place.
Okay.
So if the cost of raw materials or energy or maybe even wages for the workers goes up for a company, well, they've got profit margins they want to protect, right?
Naturally, keep the business running.
So often they'll try to pass those extra production costs on to us, the buyers.
Ah, so we end up paying more for the final product or service.
Exactly. We absorb their increased costs.
So in that case, it's not like our initial desire driving it up, but we're kind of footing the bill for the company's higher expenses, almost like taking on their financial pain.
That's a perfect way to describe it.
Yeah.
And, sometimes this can even start a bit of a cycle.
How so?
Well, if we're all paying more for everything, groceries, gas, rent, then workers might turn around and say, hey, my cost of living's up, I need a raise.
Makes sense.
But that raise increases the company's labor costs again, right?
Right.
Which could potentially lead them to raise prices again to cover that. It can become this upward spiral.
Okay, so it definitely feels like our power as consumers matters, both when we really, really want something and drive demand, and also when companies pass their rising costs on to us. But the article does say our influence isn't unlimited.
No, definitely not.
What kind of things can limit how much our demand or even our willingness to pay higher prices actually controls things?
Well, think about industries where you don't have much choice. Maybe your internet provider or a specific utility company.
Yeah, only one or two options in town.
Right. In those cases, their ability to set prices isn't quite as directly tied to your individual demand bouncing around. They have more inherent market power.
Okay, lack of competition. What else?
Government policies are huge. Think about taxes on things like cigarettes or alcohol that pushes the price way up, regardless of basic demand.
Or subsidies that might lower the cost of something, like maybe solar panels sometimes.
Exactly. Those policy levers can often outweigh simple consumer demand. And then, of course, there's the big picture, the overall economy.
Like recessions or booms?
Yeah, are people feeling secure in their jobs? Are they confident enough to spend money, or are they saving more because they're worried? That general economic mood massively influences our collective purchasing power.
Got it. Okay, let's pivot then. Let's talk about the shareholders, the investors. The article puts their influence more on the supply side. How do their expectations, their actions, actually impact the prices we end up paying?
One key thing is the constant pressure shareholders put on companies for, well, profit, for good returns on their investment.
Right, that's why they invest.
So imagine a company's own costs are going up, materials, energy, whatever. They know shareholders are watching those profit numbers closely.
Mm.
So there can be a really strong incentive for the company to raise its prices, maybe even a bit more than just covering costs, to make sure those profit targets are hit and the shareholders stay happy. Keeps the stock price looking good.
Ah, okay. So it's not just about covering the bare minimum increase in costs. There's this extra layer of needing to perform for investors, and that can nudge prices higher for
This
us.
certainly can play a role, yeah. And shareholder influence goes beyond just reacting to costs. They can push for bigger strategic moves too,
Like what?
like maybe urging the company to expand into a whole new country or to pour millions into developing some cutting-edge technology.
Okay, big bets for future growth.
Right. And those things can be great for the company long term, but they cost a lot of money up front.
And someone has to pay for it eventually.
Exactly. Often those initial investment costs need to be recouped somehow. And sometimes that translates into, well, higher prices on the products or services for a while.
Right, you invest now, but we might see the bill at the checkout later. Now, the article also mentions shareholders affecting the actual supply of goods. That sounds quite direct. How does that work?
It can be pretty direct. Let's say shareholders in a particular industry, maybe, I don't know, fossil fuels or something, start getting nervous about its long-term future.
Okay, maybe due to climate policies or changing consumer preferences.
Yeah, exactly. If a lot of them start thinking, maybe this isn't the best place for my money anymore, and they begin selling off their shares.
Dumping the stock.
Right. That can make it much harder for companies in that sector to raise new capital. They might struggle to get loans or investment needed to, say, build new facilities or even just maintain the production they have.
So less investment might mean less capacity to produce.
Potentially, yes. If the overall ability of that industry to supply its product shrinks, but demand from consumers stays roughly the same, well, basic economics tells you prices are likely to go up.
Less supply, same demand, equals higher prices.
Yeah.
Okay. So shareholders deciding to exit an industry can indirectly trigger inflation in that sector by tightening supply.
It's definitely a mechanism, yes.
But just like us consumers, the article points out shareholders don't have total control either. What puts the brakes on their influence?
Well, ultimately, we consumers still hold a pretty big trump card: demand.
Ah,
If shareholders push companies to raise prices so high that people just say, nope, not paying that and stop buying, or they switch to a cheaper alternative.
then the company's sales fall.
Right. Profits go down, the share price probably follows, and suddenly those shareholders aren't so happy anymore. So consumer pushback is a major limit.
Okay, and regulations.
Government regulations, absolutely. Things like antitrust laws designed to prevent monopolies or price controls on essential services like utilities in some places. These rules can definitely limit how much shareholder desire for profit can dictate the final price.
Okay, so we've got this picture now. Consumers influencing through demand and absorbing costs, shareholders influencing through investment expectations and supply effects. Both have power, both have limits.
It's a complex interplay.
Right. So now let's get to that core point the article makes. Why is this whole debate who has more power, us or them? Why is that discussion something the article calls the hierarchical establishment and politicians tend to sidestep? Why isn't this front and center?
Yeah, this is where it gets really pointed, doesn't it? The article suggests that actually digging into this question forces us to confront some, let's say, uncomfortable realities about our economic system.
Okay, like what? What's the first big reason?
The first reason highlighted is that it throws a harsh light on the unequal distribution of wealth and income.
How so?
Well, think about who shareholders typically are. Often they're individuals who are already relatively wealthy, or they're large institutions, pension funds, etc.
Right, people with capital to invest.
Whereas consumers are, well, pretty much everybody, including a huge number of working-class people, people on fixed incomes, people with much less economic power overall.
Okay.
So if you start seriously asking, is shareholder power driving up prices for everyday people?
Mm.
You're immediately highlighting this this fundamental power imbalance.
You're asking if the system is structured in a way that prioritizes returns for the wealthy few, potentially at the expense of the broader population's cost of living.
Exactly. And that's a very sensitive topic, isn't it? Especially for those who benefit from or are responsible for maintaining the current economic setup. It questions the fairness of the system itself.
Yeah, I can see why that might be a conversation some would prefer to avoid. It's like asking if the game is rigged from the start. What's the second major reason the article gives for this avoidance?
The second key point is that opening up this debate inevitably draws attention to the government's role.
How the government manages inflation and the economy generally.
Precisely. If you're dissecting how much influence consumers have versus shareholders, you naturally start asking what rules are in place, what regulations exist or maybe don't exist to balance these interests.
Right. Are there policies that maybe give shareholders more leverage? Or maybe not enough protections for consumers?
Exactly. You start questioning the effectiveness of existing government policies. Maybe monetary policy, fiscal policy, tax laws, deregulation. Did these actions help control inflation? Or did they perhaps inadvertently make it worse or favor one group over the other?
So digging into the consumer versus shareholder power dynamic could potentially expose shortcomings in government strategy or reveal policy choices that might be unpopular if people really understood their impact.
Yes. It could lead to criticism of specific decisions, past or present. It might create pressure for changes, maybe new regulations or taxes that certain powerful interests would strongly oppose.
So it's often just easier, perhaps, for political leaders to talk about inflation in broad, general terms and, you know, global pressures, supply chain issues, rather than getting into the messy details of who holds power within the domestic economy and whether government actions are tilting the scales.
That seems to be the argument the article is making, yes. It's politically safer to avoid that specific power analysis.
Okay, so summing it all up then, it sounds like the article's core message is, yes, both consumers and shareholders definitely influence inflation through demand, through costs, through supply, through investment. It's complicated.
No single cause.
But the real kicker is that the discussion about which group has more sway and why often gets pushed aside.
Right, because it touches on those sensitive nerves.
Nerves about wealth inequality, about fundamental power imbalances in the economy, and about the potential successes or failures of government policy in managing it all fairly.
That's basically it. The piece argues that a full understanding of inflation requires looking beyond just the simple mechanics and asking those harder questions about who benefits, who pays, and why the debate itself might be shaped by those in power.
And that really brings it back home for anyone listening, doesn't it? The article seems to be nudging us, whether we think of ourselves mainly as consumers trying to make ends meet, or maybe even as people with some investments,
Yeah, it applies either way.
to just be more aware of these different levers of influence, to maybe ask some tougher questions ourselves of companies, of politicians, about fairness and accountability in the economy.
Exactly. Recognizing these underlying dynamics, this potential tension, helps you engage more critically with what you hear about the economy, about inflation, about policy choices. It's about seeing the forces that shape our own financial realities a bit more clearly.
So maybe here's a final thought to take away from this deep dive. Now that you've heard about this potential push and pull between consumer power and shareholder influence, and the suggestion that the conversation around it is sometimes deliberately avoided, how might that change how you interpret things? When you see the next headline about rising prices, or hear about a company's profit report, or listen to a politician explaining economic strategy, will you view it through a slightly different lens now, thinking about these underlying power dynamics? It's definitely something worth mulling over.